Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. I'm Jim Hamilton, Professor of Economics at UCSD. Let me remind everybody that we will be recording today's event. And please use the chat button on your screen if you have any questions or comments, and then we'll try to call on you when we get to the Q&A part of our event a little later on. And if you like, after the event at 9 o'clock, feel free to stick around for a few moments for some less formal interaction with each other and with us to talk about what we're doing. So before I get to today's topic, let me tell you a little about what's coming up next. You've all noticed the cryptocurrency meltdown, but even while that's been happening, central banks around the world are making plans to get in the game themselves, to issue their own digital currency as maybe the official currency of a country. And how's that going to work? What's the new monetary system going to look like? Well, on December 7th, we'll welcome Dr. Hyun-Song Shin as an economic advisor and head of research for the Bank of International Settlements. He's been studying these questions and knows more about them than anybody else I know. And that'll be another online event. That's December 7th, and you don't want to miss it. Let me tell you a little about what we've got planned for next year, for 2023. We're planning to use a hybrid system where some of the events will be online like this one, and some of the events will be in person in the faculty club. And we'll give you more details once we get those settled, but that's our basic vision for the coming year. If you have thoughts about either the format or topics you'd like to see covered, please pass those along to one of the members of the steering committee. Let us know your thoughts about what you want to see. That would be Don Billings, Jeff Lewin, Joe Marshall, Terry Moore, Alan Nevin, John Reese, Manny Labrinos, Melissa McGrain, and Alex Rojas. Let me also take this opportunity to thank our corporate sponsor, the CFA Society, and also our table sponsors, California Western School of Law, Terry Moore, Reese Investment Management, Solon Hill, Expera Group, and Alex Rojas from Shore Point Realty. And now for today's event. The U.S. auto industry has been one of the most important parts of the U.S. economy for nearly a century now. But with the spike in gasoline prices this year, more consumers than ever are trying to look for alternatives to conventional cars. And as you all know, recently the state of California announced an ambitious plan that there will be no new gasoline-powered cars sold in California beginning in 2035. So is that even feasible? And what's the future look like for the U.S. auto industry and implications of that for the U.S. economy? We're very fortunate today to hear from someone who's on the front lines of looking at these questions in a very practical, realistic way. Elaine Buckberg is chief economist for General Motors. She previously served as a principal at the Battle Group, a deputy assistant secretary with U.S. Treasury Department, senior vice president at NERA Economic Consulting, and also a staff economist at the International Monetary Fund. She holds a PhD in economics from MIT. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Elaine Buckberg.
Thank you, Jim, and I'm thrilled to be with you all today, albeit virtually. Yes, it's possible that California will only sell EVs at least for light duty vehicles by 2035. So let me thank Jim and Valerie for inviting me here today. And also on the line today is my colleague, Tim Moore, a microeconomist on GM's economic staff, who has been my close partner in developing today's materials. I'm thrilled to talk to you about the EV transition, one of my favorite topics, as well as its macroeconomic benefits. So at GM, I do want you to know that we believe in a future of zero emissions, zero crashes, and zero congestion. And the road to those three things is about electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles and increasing autonomous features that can prevent crashes and resulting congestion. And we have set a variety of very ambitious goals for us. And I can share some of those with you today before getting into the details. First of all, we aspire by 2035 to eliminate tailpipe emissions from light duty vehicles. And at the White House last August, that is August of 2021, Mary Barra pledged to target 40 to 50% EVs as a share of our US sales. And we've also set a goal of 1 million EVs sold in North America in 2025. By 2035, we committed to 100% renewable energy for electricity to power our global facilities, but we're planning to do that by 2025 here in the US. And by 2040, we aspire to be carbon neutral in our global products and our operations. Let's start talking today about why I believe that the auto industry will indeed tip to EVs. And as a starting point, our market research has been showing for years that consumers are completely open to an electric vehicle as long as they give up nothing that they like about their internal combustion engine vehicle. So they want it to be roughly cost competitive. There's a little bit of willingness to pay less in recognition of the lower ownership costs, both for fueling and maintenance. But there's also a lot of evidence about myopia in auto buyers. They want a comparable range with their ICE engine, and their expectations are rising. So now the key threshold seems to be getting to be 350 miles of range. They want charging to be ubiquitous and convenient. For most people, 75% of new vehicle buyers have an owned home with dedicated parking. They can charge at home, but they want to know that it's there for highway road trips, fast charging and readily available, or if they need to charge on the go. And some people, of course, live in apartments or other housing where they'll need to use community charging. And then they don't want to give up any of their choice about what the car is going to look like. They want the same selection of body styles. They want great styling interior and exterior. And so, for example, I own one of our Chevy Bolts. I love it, but for me, my husband, and our small dog, that's fine. But if I were my friend Taffany with her daughter who plays hockey, carrying around 4 girls and their hockey bags, it wouldn't suit. So there needs to be that SUV available for her and for everyone to fit their taste. But we do see through our market research that there is a march up in interest in EVs that we can see quarter to quarter in our market research. And so on the left-hand side here is the results of surveys asking consumers that whether they're interested in electric propulsion on vehicles versus traditional internal combustion engines. In 2017, it was 20%. In 2021, it was 31%. This year it's 42%. So like extremely dynamic. And on the right-hand side, you can see there's that interest across all segments. It's not just people who want new cars. So across all of the market, it's about 50%. But when we ask them about either what segment of vehicle they own today or they're thinking of buying, and then assess their interest, the midpoints are 64% in Lux. And that's partly because there's just been more EV entries in the Lux space early on, 44% in pickups. Okay. 44% in pickups, what you might think is the most traditional part of industry and where people tow and haul, 52% for mainstream cars and 46% for mainstream SUVs. And this is national, not just California. So really rapid growth. When we look at third-party forecasts of EV adoption, you can see here that there's a pretty wide cone across these, but the median forecast is 15% at 2025 and 39% in 2030. I know everyone's assessing the Inflation Reduction Act and its impact on EV sales through both the EV tax commercial and used EV tax credits, but also its other provisions. I think it's likely these forecasts are more likely to go up than down. And indeed, EV share of industry-wide sales is evolving rapidly. So you can see here on the left-hand side of this graph, up through 2018, it's just about 0.5 percentage point. In 2020, we saw more change. We saw 1.7% of sales. 2021, 3.2%. Year to date, 4.7%. So just like an exponential increase that you can see with your eye in EV purchases. And part of that is that the availability is changing and the entries are changing. And the root of pretty much all of this about that ability to provide, to bring down costs, to provide the range people want, to provide for different sizes, is about bringing down battery costs. And you can see here on the left-hand side what's happened according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance surveys to battery pack costs. In 2010, at the start of this, it was over $1,200 per kilowatt hour. In the most recent survey, it was $132 per kilowatt hour. And Bloomberg New Energy Finance's expectation is that we'll reach $59 per kilowatt hour by 2030. Others are actually more optimistic. That's a 20% CAGR. And I would argue that given the amount of research dedicated to batteries, that's public and private and global, we're likely to see breakthroughs, not asymptoting. And if you don't believe me, look at COVID vaccines. And as a result, the electric range that's available in vehicles is expanding again, moving towards that ideal of 350 for everything. And of course, people would gladly take more. So back in model year 2011, right, there were EVs, but the range was really limited. You have to be a very rational consumer who says, like, here's my daily, I'm buying this as a commuter car, here's my daily commute, that'll work for me. Most people are not that rational consumers with respect to their auto, though. They want it to do everything they might possibly do. Model year 2018, Tesla was offering 335 miles range on some of its vehicles. The Chevrolet Bolt came out offering 238 miles, but the median was still 125. So if you looked across EVs, they were still somewhat limited in their use. But model year 2022 is completely different. In model year 2022, first of all, if you want to spring 6 figures for a Lucid, you can get 520 miles of range. But the median range on EVs now is 259, which, most new vehicle owners don't take a 250-mile one-way road trip in the year. So really, that suits most people's needs. And that will continue to grow and again, become more interchangeable with internal combustion engine vehicles as battery costs come down. Most of the EV growth we've seen so far is in luxury cars and SUVs. And that's because it still costs more, and the luxury buyer is more able to absorb that additional cost, and we're able to price it in. So you can see on the right-hand side that in 2 of these 3 luxury segments, sort of mid-size luxury SUVs and sort of mid-size luxury cars, that there's a substantial percentage of sales in EVs, 21% for Lux SUV 3, 37 for Lux Car 3. Larger Lux SUVs, it's still really tiny. Our big mainstream segments are to the left. There have been negligible EV sales in them. But what you can see here is how much greater the opportunity is as those mainstream entries come out to increase EV sales as a share of those markets. And those entries are coming. So here on the left-hand side, it's just the number of EV entries by year, obviously 2021 in the past, and the other years are forecasted by IHS, and we've taken out very small entries. 29 in 2021, tripling to 89 in 2023, and then doubling yet again to 170 by 2025. Again, where these entries are matters. So on the right-hand side, you can see that, first of all, the bright blue is again 2021. You can see in 2020, there were only 4 cars, heart of the market, mainstream SUVs, there were 9. There were more Lux entries available than there were mainstream entries, and there were a few pickups sold by Rivian. This year, there are 25 SUVs and crossovers, right? That is the heart of the auto market today. And that expands to 48 by 2025. So the breadth of entries is arising to meet everyone's need. this year has really shined a light on high gas prices have really shined a light on the difference in fueling costs. And I think maybe helped consumers who aren't good at doing present discounted values and thinking long-term about that differential. So here we've taken average annual mileage of 12,416. We've taken the price of electricity per kilowatt hour, a national average, and we've used a range of different gas prices where 375 is the price of about a week ago. We've looked at the average miles per gallon and kilowatt hours or miles per kilowatt hour for ICE and EVs and done some calculations. So BEV, about $600. That average car and average mileage at 375 per gallon. And that's a national average gas price. California prices run high, just shy of $2,000. So savings of almost $1,400 per year. You know, at $5 a gallon, it's much more compelling. It's savings of over $2,000 a year, all the way down to $3, which is the average for last year. Still savings of about $1,000 per year. And I think as there is more and more experience with EVs, people talk to their friends who have them, they will become more able to think about that. In addition, EVs need vastly less maintenance. So you may take your vehicle in for servicing every 6 months. My Bolt EV, rotate the tires at 7,500 miles for service at 15,000. What about charging? So according to work by McKinsey, they estimate that most early adopters will do the majority of their charging at home or at work, but that'll evolve over time, partly as the buyer evolves over time. So again, 75% of new vehicle buyers have an owned home and dedicated parking where they could install home charging. And in 2020, McKinsey estimated that about 73% of kilowatt hours of charging happened at home. Next category was work, and workplace charging is a way to make charging available to people who don't necessarily have home charging, installing it in those workplace parking lots. And then on the highway was only about 7%, and public community charging 6%. They see that shifting, that home's still the majority of it, but first of all, more vehicles with longer range, larger share of the park, that highway charging will go up, the long distance to 12 and public to 14%. And it'll be really critical to see DC fast charging rolled out under on the highway corridors to enable that and to remove that sort of psychological blockage of, even if I never really do a road trip, I want to know I can do one, and that charging will be easy and it'll be reasonably rapid. And DC fast charging, it varies on the charger and the vehicle's pace to intake, but on a fast charger, the new Hummer could go like 20% to 80% in about 20 to 30 minutes. And that's on a 400-mile range. You probably need to stop at least once every 400 miles. So, and policy really matters in driving adoption. And a number of recent federal policies brought out by the Biden administration will powerfully drive EV investment by automakers and EV adoption by buyers. So first of all, from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Package, there's $7.5 billion dedicated to public investment in charging stations, with a huge emphasis on charging that is immediately off the highway. We've actually at GM have invested with Pilot and Flying J to roll out charging every 50 miles at minimum, immediately off the highway. And this is also going to put investment into community charging stations. And US DOT clearly understands the importance of that the highway charging is DC fast charging. In addition, the Biden administration is targeting 500,000 additional public chargers by 2030. The Inflation Reduction Act contains a number of levers that will enhance automakers' investment in EVs and EV sales. There's a consumer purchase incentive that's for new vehicles, for used vehicles, as well as for commercial sales of EVs. So sales to companies, your landscaping company, and FedEx. There are production tax credits to support domestic development of critical mineral processing and EV battery production to incentivize that activity in the US. There are grants to support the transition of auto manufacturing facilities to EV production. And there are very powerful, more stringent standards for greenhouse gases and fuel economy that will powerfully drive automakers' incentives to producing more EVs. And then there are the phase out dates. So Jim, you already mentioned that California, as you can see on the right-hand side, is planning to phase out internal combustion engine vehicles by 2035. And your neighboring city of Los Angeles has set a 2030 date. But you can see here, first of all, a number of countries, mostly in Europe, have set these target dates, but Israel's put itself on the list for 2030 and Canada and China for 2040. And then there are major cities around the country, as well as the states of California, Massachusetts, and New York that have set these ambitious targets. And that's going to ultimately drive buyers, but more rapidly drive we, the automakers, to be ready for that and to have the portfolio of vehicles for that. I get a lot of questions about our EV supply chain. So let me share some insights on that. Sorry, I seem to be going a little faster than I want. So first of all, we are working ambitiously to establish an EV supply chain that will be secure, sustainable, scalable, and cost competitive. So what do I mean about that? First of all, secure. It is true that right now supply chains are global, and China right now controls about half of some of the mineral extraction or upstream processing and about 70% of midstream processing of critical minerals. We are actively working to localize as much of that supply chain as possible. And or put it into asset-rich allies. So for example, our lithium comes from Australia, and the Inflation Reduction Act creates some powerful incentives for us to move even faster. But on the next page, I'll show you what we're doing. In terms of sustainable, we're prioritizing sustainable practices in the extraction, refining, processes and other technologies. So for example, we're working with the mining partners that extract some of these minerals to use more EVs in the mining vehicles. And we're looking at a circular economy for critical minerals of recycling and reuse. Scalable, well, there needs to be enough to meet global demand. We can't really move to EVs on a large scale unless we have a really large scale access to all of these minerals. And then cost competitive, again, if it costs much more, that transition is going to be very difficult. So let's look at some of the details. So I realize this is too much to read, but here you can see this is about 8 different partnerships that we have already arrived at for our supply chain in terms of looking to secure supplies and supplies that are done in a sustainable way, overwhelmingly flowing through North America. And we've got partnerships on lithium, one of which is with Controlled Thermal Resources and is actually at the Hell's Kitchen project. And it's a very green lithium extraction process as well. We're using cobalt from Glencore from Australia, and we've greatly reduced the cobalt content in our batteries by about 70%. And so a wide range of efforts, and we really only expect to have more of these announcements to come. The Inflation Reduction Act is encouraging us to accelerate, but we've been making these announcements since last November. But in the long run, the raw material supply chain for EVs is older EVs, and it's recycling those batteries, and it's using recycled materials. And so our Ultium Cells battery joint venture with LG has an agreement with Li-Cycle to recycle up to 100% of scrap for the manufacturing process, but we're also expecting that over time, we'll be recycling batteries from used vehicles. Right now, we're recycling cobalt and nickel. We expect to expand that to also include graphite, copper, manganese, and aluminum. It's a new process that currently emits 30% fewer emissions than traditional recycling process. And the recovery rate is comfortably north of 90% for all of these materials. So really, we are looking at a long-term future of reuse, not extraction. So I'm really excited to talk with you today about benefits of EVs, though, that I feel are underappreciated. And those are the macroeconomic benefits. And Jim, you talked for years ago about, or wrote, including your 1983 JPE paper, about to what extent oil shocks preceded post-World War II recessions. And you said that it was 9 out of 10 of the post-World War II, but pre-COVID recessions. And EVs can help reduce our vulnerability to those shocks. So first of all, it can improve macroeconomic stability by reducing our vulnerability to those oil price shocks. And as we shift transportation energy demand away from oil products, gas and diesel, to electricity, it's going to reduce basically our overall average energy price volatility. Because even in its current composition, the energy sources that power the electricity grid they're diversified, they have more stable prices, and they're less affected by international prices, and they're less vulnerable to geopolitical risk. And that means that we'll be able to increasingly insulate consumers from the volatility in gas price shocks, especially those upward spikes, which negatively impact consumer sentiment, and that hits consumption and GDP, even though the U.S. economy is far less oil price sensitive than it used to be. And of course, over time, the composition of the sources of energy powering the electricity grid are evolving. They're cleaner over time. And then when you further combine that with optimizing charging times, we can also greatly reduce emissions. So climate benefits, but also macroeconomic benefits. Global oil prices are really volatile, right? So here is a graph. The green line is regular gasoline. The two blue lines, or aquamarine and blue lines, are Brent, sort of the most global oil price, and the one that most closely affects gasoline prices, and West Texas Intermediate. Very volatile, and gas follows right behind. And of course, some of those spikes are caused by different things, but that includes geopolitical risk in the Middle East and decisions by OPEC. And as Jim research has shown, right, there's close correlation between run-up in oil prices and recessions. And Jim's done statistical work that strongly suggests causation, but clearly that was the cause of the 1970s energy crises. And so it's a clear downside. Oil price volatility and oil price spikes, clear downside risk to the US economy, even though we've become less vulnerable. But EV owners are going to be insulated from that to a large extent. So here, this is hypothetical monthly US average fueling costs, same kind of calculation I showed you before, for an ICE in the blue line at the top, and for a battery electric vehicle in the aquamarine line below, right? One line's a lot flatter than the other. Now, how consumer energy prices are set varies across jurisdictions, but this is based on average national electricity prices. Most consumers do not face big month-to-month or day-to-day or hour-to-hour volatility in their prices. And the US electricity grid's about 60% fossil fuels, 40% nuclear and renewables. Those fossil fuels are coal and natural gas, in which we're overwhelmingly self-sufficient. In fact, we're substantial net exporters, and the prices are vastly less volatile. And because we're self-sufficient, not vulnerable to geopolitical events. So you can see here on the left-hand side that Brent oil prices in red, very volatile. Natural gas is the middle aquamarine line. That big spike is the Texas deep freeze and South Central deep freeze in February of 2021, but generally stable, and spikes very short. And coal prices are very stable. And you can see on the right side that we're big net exporters of both natural gas and coal. Natural gas since about 2016, and coal, it's long been so. Moreover, our coal and natural gas prices are just not that closely tied to global prices, partly because it's a largely domestic market. And they're just less volatile than oil prices. Of course, coal is quite heavy. It's traded internationally, but it's heavy in relation to its value in natural gas. You either need a pipeline with a massive investment or you need liquefaction and gas regasification terminals. So you can see here the US coal prices and natural gas prices are those heavy red lines. The lighter lines are prices in other regions, and you can see that our prices tend to be the lowest and the least volatile. Now, the US economy has changed greatly with respect to oil consumption, production, and our energy use. So first of all, we have become, between crude oil and petroleum products, the higher line on the left-hand side, we have become net exporters. But we both import and export, right? Crude has different sort of weights. Refineries are optimized for different combinations of those different weights. So it's importing, exporting. We're net importers of crude, we're net exporters of refined products. And one of the things that's enabled that has been a big shift towards use of natural gas. At the same time, we've been extracting more natural gas in the US. So you can see we're huge net exporters of natural gas, but that higher use of natural gas for power generation, for heating, and for other things has partly enabled that reduced dependence on oil. At the same time, we've changed our use. We've just gotten a lot more energy efficient, and that's from the more efficient heating and air conditioning units you put in your home, better fuel economy on your vehicle, better energy and efficiency in our planets across the board. So if 1970 is 100, we're now at about 40 in terms of the energy intensity or the energy content per unit of GDP, real GDP. So how big is gas and diesel in terms of our oil and energy use? Well, it's 22 to 23% of energy use in recent years, and it's 2/3 of oil use. So it's a big piece that you can shift over time. It's really quite powerful in terms, if once we would get to 100% EV in our park and in our suite of vehicles, right? You would reduce by at least 2/3 our oil use to being well below our domestic production. Now, I just told you that the US is less the US economy overall is less correlated with oil prices and energy prices and less dependent, because in general, now, because we produce as much as we need. When consumers and businesses who are energy consumers spend more, that's transferred to other entities in the economy and may be transferred also across regions of the economy. And so that the net impact of $1 increase in oil prices or $10 increase in oil price in the US economy is negative, but quite small. But the thing that the models don't capture that well is the sentiment channel. And the sentiment channel is powerful. And this is just consumer sentiment, but the left-hand graph shows you a scatter plot between the University of Michigan's index of consumer sentiment on the horizontal axis, and on the y-axis, the inflation-adjusted US average gasoline price. Clear negative slope, negative correlation of about 0.6. And there's also a variety of papers, academic research papers that establish that channel between consumer sentiment and gas prices. It's interesting that the Binder and Macroeconomic working paper basically says it's strongest for those consumers who either lived through the 1970s and remember that correlation, and highly educated people who probably took an economics class and were taught it. But it's a powerful thing, and you can really see it in recent consumer sentiment developments as oil prices and gas prices have gone up. So it still really matters. So what about mass adoption? So let's talk about 2020 mix of the electricity grid and what happens as we shift our park or the overall operating vehicle fleet that's registered. So that's where the leftmost bar is where we are today. The park is 100, even though sales are going up to about 5% EV, the overall composition of those vehicles is 100%. gasoline consuming. So energy consumption for vehicle transportation, 100% oil and gas. But if we get to 80%, which I think is a feasible 2030 goal, then it would be 80% of the energy consumption for transportation would be gas and oil. And actually, again, holding constant the composition of the grid, about 8% renewables. And then if you get to about 50% of the park, and the average vehicle is about 12 years old. So this takes time unless you have scrappage incentives. You're 50% in oil and gas, 30% other fossil fuels, and 20% renewables. If we actually use projections of what the grid looks like in 2040, that becomes about 28% renewables and about 70% or 72% fossil fuels. Now, and that's sort of no adjustment for how we're charging. So here's a forecast from the Energy Information Agency about the transition in the energy grid. So 2020, the dotted line, about 60% fossil fuels. The Energy Information Agency projects that will be about 45% by fossil fuels by 2040. And then there's the possibility of optimizing when and how we charge. And if I use the My Chevrolet app, I can optimize when my Bolt EV charges. I can plug it in when I get home and set it to charge when I want. And so a new paper by Holland, Manser, and Yates, or the latest version, says that if we electrify 100% of car miles traveled, so that's like a long time in the future, we could decrease electricity sector carbon emissions, just the electricity sector, if we charge vehicles during the day. So we increase from the electricity. Obviously, you need to net out emissions from the vehicles themselves if we switch from internal combustion engine to EV. But then but that's just electricity sector emissions before any netting. But even before any netting, if you just optimize your charging time, you can reduce electricity sector emissions from where we are today. If you further net out the avoided gas and diesel emissions, they estimate that the welfare gains can increase by as much as 9 to 28% with optimized charging. So let's conclude and then move to your questions. The EV transition will really dramatically reduce U.S. vulnerability to macroeconomic shocks stemming from oil price volatility and related geopolitical risk. So it decreases economic volatility, especially downside risk. And the EV transition switches our energy consumption away from crude to self-sufficient sources that power the grid. EV owners can expect more stable and lower fueling costs on average, recognizing some variation, but overwhelmingly, and we study the electricity prices across states for this, and avoiding those gas price shocks reduces downside to consumer sentiment. Last, the climate benefits of the EV transition will only increase over time as the electricity grid becomes cleaner. So with that, I'm happy to turn to questions. And Jim, you want to take my slides down now or keep them up?
Oh, you keep them up in case somebody might want to ask you to go back to them. But thanks, a very informative talk. Let me remind people, if you have questions or would like to contribute to the conversation, use your chat button and we'll call on you. I'd like to start off with a question of my own, if I may. So in your introductory remarks, you talked about a vision of autonomous driving vehicles interacting with each other on the freeway, which is so captivating an idea. There's so much wasted energy and time and traffic congestion. And you also mentioned fatalities, but obviously there's a coordination problem there. We kind of all have to be doing it. So which comes first, the chicken or the egg? You talked in EV about, some cities even making rules and the companies are getting prepared. Is there a vision for how we can move to that kind of system, or is it not really feasible?
So you don't need everyone to be in an autonomous vehicle or even a connected vehicle to make that transition. And there are two avenues under which it's going to happen simultaneously. So one would be fleet vehicles that are autonomous or overwhelmingly autonomous. Come back to this in a second. And the other would be increased driver assistance features on vehicles that will increasingly protect you from crashes, and also increasingly enable you to sort of take that cognitive load off. So first of all, our cruise automation subsidiary that operates out of San Francisco actually received approval a few months ago, not only to operate driverless vehicles on the road, but actually in sort of night hours from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Charge for those rides, which is sort of a higher threshold. And you can go on the internet and search like cruise self-driving and get videos of people riding in the vehicles and what they're saying about how well they drive versus the average taxi driver, Uber or Lyft driver. And those vehicles are in a geo-fenced area of San Francisco, and they're level 4 automation, which is to say that there are people available to assist the vehicle if the vehicle needs assistance. The vehicle can pull itself over and ask for help, basically. But the goal is, of course, that the error rate is lower in the EV than with the human driver. And of course, those autonomous vehicles are going to keep getting better, and the human drivers won't. And then in terms of the driver assistance features, if you have a newer vehicle, you may have invested in safety technologies that have front-end collision prevention and side blind spot alert. And you may have experienced that, like a deer crosses the road, or someone brakes suddenly in front of you and your car stops sort of before you start hitting the brake. And those are pretty powerful protectants. And then right now we offer on some of our vehicles super cruise technology, which means on the highway and selected highways, you can take your hands off the wheel. You have to keep your eyes on the road. It's watching your eyes. And we'll tell you if you do. But you can take your hands off the wheel. And you can feel in minutes, not only that you're able to relax your arms and your legs, but that the cognitive load is down from all those tiny little adjustments you make. And the next generation, which of Ultra Cruise, will be designed to do that from your driveway to your destination. And so those vehicles are coming, and we do plan to have in market in this decade the first personal autonomous vehicles that you could own.
Thanks. So let's turn it over to the audience now. When I call on you, if you could please unmute yourself. Maybe if you have a video, put that on so we can see you talking. So Don Billings, you want to ask your questions?
Yes. Hi, good morning, and thank you for that talk. And thank you for calling out thermal resources out here in the Salton Sea. A couple of real quick questions, I'll abbreviate them. One is, given that batteries are a significant cost component and weight component for EVs, and given that the average vehicle trip is really quite short, will GM offer a broader range, including entry-level vehicles that have much shorter range? I don't want to pay, an extra $10,000 for a vehicle for 500-mile range that I don't need. And then secondly, here in California, when you're considering total cost of the vehicle use, our state legislature is actually seriously talking about paying $1,000 a year to households to not purchase cars. And at the same time, our county transportation planners are extremely anti-car and are actively considering policies to increase the cost per mile of operating any vehicle, including an EV. Could you talk about those factors?
So let's start with the first one. Our goal is to make affordable vehicles with 300, 350 miles of range. And so that's what we're heading towards. And we just showcased the Equinox EV last week that will enter the market next year. And that's expected to offer 300 miles of range and start around $30,000. So really already getting into the heart of the market. You don't have to make that trade-off. In terms of policies that will reduce vehicle ownership. So one aspect is the number of vehicles. There's vehicles on the road, and congestion issues, and there are also parking issues. So one is, if you have fewer owned vehicles and you have more sort of shared fleet vehicles, then you are not reducing the total number of miles driven, but you're reducing the number of vehicles in operation at any given time, they'll sort of run through their lifetime faster. But that can reduce space for parking, and in dense areas, that sort of sharing can be very sensible. But in terms of turning people away from private vehicle ownership, especially outside of those dense urban areas. So one, you either need, you need shared vehicles, you need transit. In California, it's really great to say bike everywhere. It doesn't work so well in Michigan in the winter, for example. But transit's expensive. All levels of government are challenged in committing to those investment, and interest in riding on transit has not recovered yet from COVID, and it's not, the path of that is unclear. So the path of sharing transit and personal ownership, seems to lean more towards personal ownership since the pandemic, although obviously we don't have a clear visibility to how recovery and preferences is post-pandemic. So I think that's challenging. And again, it depends across climates and regions. When California is also super hot, as I know you have suffered through, those of you who are actually in California, biking is probably also not very viable.
Thanks. Mike Jason, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you very much for the talk and the opportunity. A fellow Bolt owner, I'm happy to say, good to be part of the club. My family's been huge supporters of EVs. We love them, but I really don't understand the savings on the net energy usage. SDG&E provides a tremendous incentive to charge between midnight and 6 a.m. here in California. 4 to 9 p.m. is 56 cents a kilowatt, nearly 6 times more expensive. Basically, it means we are heavily incentivized to charge in the middle of the night, which is purely fossil fuels. So I don't really see the huge environmental savings if we're burning gas somewhere so I can charge my car at night. Is there something I'm missing?
Well, the charging and the pricing from the utilities may evolve over time. So that early evening hours tend to have lower renewables available and also high demand. So they may be our sort of the most challenged point in time. There are hours of the day probably where there's excess supply of renewables, where like it's literally negatively priced, and there's the desire to offtake. So how do you solve for that? So first of all, there's a few different ways. So the simpler ways are, one, there'll be more work from home. You may be able to plug in at home and set your charging time while someone is at home, while the vehicle is at home. Two, there may be more workplace charging available, so you charge at your workplace during those peak hours. And then there's, options of battery storage. Battery storage, whether in your home or central battery storage, that takes power when it's cheap and ample and perhaps in excess supply, and supplies it later when electricity is at higher priced and in greater demand. And in the future, there will also be more inverter technology on vehicles, which may mean that you can actually supply your house during those peak hours from your vehicle that you charge during other hours.
Thanks. Mark Jacobson.
Hi, thanks. I really enjoyed the talk. One thing that has been puzzling me about the sort of macroeconomic piece is how great is the risk of a collapse in oil prices, and how bad would that be, and for who, right? So if oil prices go down quite a lot, it might be bad for governments needing to spend a lot more on subsidies to cause people to buy the cars, or it might be bad for manufacturers or drivers. I'm curious if this is something you've thought about and how great you think that risk might be.
Forgive me for flipping quickly. I just want to get back to
Sure.
one of these slides. And then also moving the chat off that. So first of all, a fall in oil prices from a macroeconomic perspective, bad for oil producing companies and and oil producing regions of the country, but good for oil consumers and in the US and generally. So a little bit of redistribution back towards the consumers. And I mean, both like
with
companies.
respect to the EV producers, though, I guess that was who it might be bad
well,
for,
but
right? Not the,
here,
yeah.
even at $3 a gallon, which was the average price last year, when oil prices were pretty low in the beginning of the year and ramped up somewhat over the course of the year, the savings just on fueling is almost $1,000 a year. And then there's the, the savings on maintenance costs. So it's still favorable. And as the price differential compresses over time, that becomes all the more compelling. And as, again, people aren't great at doing players and discounted value, but when the guy at the next desk and their neighbor and the person at, whatever church or gym or whatever says, hey, yeah, my electricity bill's only this much higher and you're paying $50 at the pump, I think people will start to better understand those savings.
Thanks.
Great point. Julie Cullen?
I just had a quick question about the consumer purchase incentives. I've had sort of two experiences where I've seen the prices evolve directly with the incentives. So it was when we were purchasing the solar panels. The incentives kind of dropped in the middle of this arrangement, and when we lost access to the incentives, the prices fell. And also just recently purchased the Chevy Bolt as well. And the new version is, thank you, is it's priced several $1,000s less. And one of the reasons the car dealership argued that was the case was because it's not eligible for the tax incentive. And so I was just wondering if you have any evidence or experience with the likelihood that the tax incentives actually just allow the companies to raise the prices.
Well, I think one thing you need to keep in mind is that we as automakers have very powerful incentives to sell EVs. Both because we want to, we at GM certainly want to become a dominant player in this market, but also because we have powerful regulatory incentives to sell EVs. So we really want to sell a lot of EVs and as many as we can make. Now, the new credit's quite complicated. And I think that there will be somewhat lower, across the industry, probably fewer transactions will be eligible in 2020. It's like maybe a little less than 2023, definitely in 2024 and 25. I think it's going to be a little more challenging. And it's, I think we're all working through that. But again, we have really powerful incentives, all of us, to increase our sales towards EVs, or most of us. There are some automakers that are really have focused much more highly on hybrids and have a somewhat different strategy. They may view it a little differently. And so that will greatly affect our pricing strategy. So wanting to win an EV really prevents a big run up in prices.
Bill Proffer, could you unmute yourself? Are you still on? Why don't we turn to Barry Demchak?
Sorry, I'm sorry.
Okay, Bill. Yeah, great.
Yeah, apologize. Trying to find the mute button here as usual.
Yeah.
I great presentation. I was particularly intrigued with the slide on the relationship of gas prices and recessions. That's a good one. There's unintended consequences. I've been reading about, there is this huge ecosystem around ICE supply chains and all of your subcontractors and suppliers for all the parts for the cars. Some angst about that recently, about the effects of EVs on that, because EVs are so much simpler in terms of parts and other things. And then is there anybody thinking about a plan to transition gas stations to charging stations? I mean, there's really no reason to build new facilities when we have this huge infrastructure of gas stations and mom and pop convenience stores. And then the final question is just around the repair issue. I mean, EVs require, as you pointed out in your talk, just rotate the tires and things like that a few miles. Any plans by GM or other people to address that ecosystem around repair costs and other things? Thank you very much.
So in this transition, everyone needs to evolve. So I think gas stations are generally known to make most of their money on the convenience store end and not on the gas sales end. if they want to continue to do that. So they're likely to incorporate more EV charging. And that's doubtless why Pilot Flying J was interested in partnering with us in putting EV charging at their existing gas stations right off the highway. And there are examples. There's a great example of what used to be a gas station and is an auto repair shop in Tacoma Park, Maryland, that just said, we're just going all EV charging. We're not even doing gas anymore. So I think you'll see that evolve. In terms of repair costs, I think that, the repairs will be different and dealers keep adapting as well. And so they'll be adapting. And I think there was a third part to the question, but I'm not sure if I'm missed the third part of your question, Bill.
No, you got all of it pretty
Okay,
much.
great.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, that's going to be interesting to watch. Appreciate the feedback. Thank you.
Great.
Okay, we have time for one last question from Peter Jupp. If you can find the unmute button. Are you still on? I can read his comment if not. Peter writes, many thanks for your presentation. All of the other societal and economic benefits you cite for EVs are available in alternative, less damaging technologies than EVs, such as fuel cell technology. Are you considering alternatives or are you all in EVs? The CO2 production costs of getting a vehicle. Okay, well, I'll let you answer that. I won't read his whole thing.
Let's take that. I think that's enough for our remaining time.
Okay.
So we are,
all right.
Fuel cells are what we think is the solution for somewhat larger and heavier vehicles. There are issues also about rolling out the charging infrastructure for fuel cell. So it's the right technology for the right kind of vehicle.
Okay, thanks so much for a fantastic presentation, Elaine. I really learned a lot. Remind everyone, December 7th, we're going to be talking about digital currencies. You don't want to miss that. I'll go ahead and stop the recording now. So that's the end of our formal event. Though, Elaine, I hope you're sticking around for just a few minutes afterwards in case we have other questions or comments we missed. But otherwise, see you all